Okay, so we want to welcome everybody back to the Cops Canteen show. This week again, it's myself, Ed Gilbert, ex-Gardaí, Ireland. We have my ex-colleague Declan Carroll, also ex-Garda in Ireland. Mads Krarup Nielsen, ex-Danish, ex-Western Australian police, and we're hoping to have our good mate Tomo, ex-Queensland police, join us. He's currently on the road, but he's going to try and jump on with us. This week, we're going to talk about the topic of have we seen a difference in how policing protests has been approached across the world, and has this approached, how is it being balanced? And we're covering this topic based on a request from an ex-police member that contacted Mads Krarup Nielsen to discuss this matter. We've broken it down into four sections. Four sections, we're just going to talk about the general topic. Second section will be what is the impact of this on the police. The second section is why do we have this inconsistency? Third section is what is the impact on the police, and the fourth section is going to be what is the impact on the people, and effectively again what can we do to help this situation and what can we do about it. So just to kick off, I came across this podcast by the National Police Radio Law correspondent Martin Cast on June the 3rd, 2020, when he ran a segment on why police departments were using different tactics to handle protests. He stated that police departments across the country have taken different approaches to protests and violence. Some departments are trained to contain and de-escalate, while others use more aggressive methods. Cast refers to the work done by the sociology professor Patrick Gillam, who has studied this topic for 20 years. Gillam observes that there was a sort of big movement of truth for the US, or moment of truth for the US after the riots there in the 60s. Okay, this was the Kerner Commission report, which looked at what happened there, and it concluded that bringing in any sort of the heavy weaponry makes things worse, and it just escalates things. Cast also refers on the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999, where liaison broke down as a small number of disruptive protesters stopped liaising with the police, which led to what he describes as an overreaction by the police. So we have a duality here where policing have been reacting in situations where there was no liaison in place. And this is something that we experienced here as well in Australia during the lockdown protests, where there was no police liaison and things were escalating pretty quick. So I'll just put it over to Mads if I can. Mads, you were asked to discuss this topic. And of course, I know that you worked tirelessly with myself over the last number of years trying to liaise between issue-motivated groups and police forces.
Yes, that's been a bit of a challenge, to put it mildly. Start off with saying my biggest challenge in doing that here in Denmark is that a lot of the protesters out here, in the beginning, they weren't really trusting in me or other people that came from the police because it was seen as the enemy. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's the tendency that's happened here in Denmark over the last years, is that the trust in police have gone down, and people they're afraid to approach them now because they think they're going to get in trouble all the time, or they end up getting beaten up or arrested. And that's a sad way that the policing have gone down here in Denmark that way. So an ex-military friend of mine, it was an ex-police, ex-military guy who approached me last week and said he liked the first show we did last week. And he would actually like us to talk or like to hear some more about why especially Danish police in the last few years have gotten so quick to get to their use of force options instead of, like we've been taught at the academies, the first use of force is your verbal communication. That seems to have been forgotten, especially here during the lockdowns. The communication with police has been almost non-existent. You can find a few people in between that you can talk to, but other than that, they run in your face very, very quickly and get very aggressive. So that's been a big...
Of course, when we don't know the rules of engagement, the situation is always extremely unpredictable on both sides.
Yeah, and lately, especially during the lockdown in Denmark, the police seem to have been the ones who's escalating the situations. One of the protests we were at, they decided to come up and stop all ex-military people. Everyone that was there in with some sort of uniform or some sort of sign that they were ex-military participating in these protests, they were stopped, had to give all the names, addresses, all these things.
Right.
I had a long discussion with a couple of former colleagues there because they stopped a former military guy, wanted his name, birthday, and address, and he gave it to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then he proceeded to leave. He said, now I've done that part, which by law I'm required to give you these things, but now I'm free to leave. They wanted to detain him there until they checked with the central to check up all on everything with him, even though they've just checked him earlier on the same day, so they know he's not wanted. They know who he is.
Yeah.
But it was more like a way to stop them from participating in the protest, that they had to detain all these people. So
Yeah.
for a while, we're standing there having a discussion with the police about the guys have actually given you what they're required to do. They're free to leave unless you charge them.
Mm-hmm.
It became a really, really almost aggressive confrontation with them because there was no way of talking to these police officers. Every time they do something and you ask them questions and you put them in doubt, they just step back, call their bosses on the phone, and then they come back like a parrot with the same answer. And that's been the tendency in Denmark over the COVID protests, that police have been so quick to escalate things, especially with the anti-lockdown protests.
It's
And it
actually,
seems,
yeah.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Mads. I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
yeah, and it seems to carry over in their daily life as well. Like at the moment in Denmark, we literally have hardly no police attending stuff like burglaries, all these things, because there's not enough people, there's not enough resources for it. But at the same hand, we can spend millions every year on sending police out to a place in Copenhagen that's called Christiania. It's like a free town that's been there since the 60s. That's
Yes.
where they run. It's a lot of marijuana sale from out there, but it's been a hippie town.
Mm-hmm.
That place has been taken over by gangs, of course, because it's organized crime. Police seem to be, just doing their normal raids out there. They come several times a day, pick up what they can, arrest a few people, and then they go again. And that's going on and on and on. Instead of like a political decision, like either you legalize it or you make a decision and clear the place out. But we're spending enormous resources on this out there, while the average everyday person are not getting any police attendance.
So
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and that's going to build up a negative image as well about the police in a general sense as well. It gives me an opportunity to bring in this another document that came across was the Harry Frank from the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation in New York, and they came up with a guide for policing protests in January 2020, which was a document based on lessons from the Occupy movement. But exactly what you say there, Mads, one of the findings was police choices in handling protests can have far-reaching effects. Research shows that when citizens view police officers using fair and respectful procedures, they are more likely to support and cooperate with police. But when a police officer is seen as unnecessarily impatient, rude, brutal, or otherwise, or unfair, people are likely to view the police and the law as illegitimate in itself. So one would think that with these studies in hand and, based on learned experience, that directions should be based upon a positive outcome, that clearly this knowledge is not being looked at, or maybe is being looked at and pushed aside by those making the directions. I mean, there's certainly reasonable cause to suspect it doesn't add up there.
I think you are looking at the last what you said, that it's the ones who's actually pushing the direction who's making these decisions.
Yes.
Because like we discussed about last week, the community policing is almost non-existing. You can no longer, in Denmark, it's hard to approach any police officer out on the road with a genuine question without them having to call their bosses first. It seems like most police you meet on the street, they're not aware of the legislation, they're not aware of their rights, they're not aware of the people's rights. They just tend to seem to be following orders blindly without asking questions to anything that they're doing.
Yeah, and this is why it's critical that we have members asking questions. I'm just going to go over to Declan. So Declan, yeah, over to you. We were talking about the importance of liaison and your experience within the job. What's your experience there?
Well, I'm very surprised and disappointed to hear the Danish experience today. I can only speak about it when I was in my time, and we used to do protests. People protesting about work conditions and that, but the heavy stuff was with the Sinn Féin, IRA, and extraditions across the border.
Yeah.
In those situations, they were completely different, and we have to bear in mind here that every country's experience is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, in all the protests that I've been on in my time between 1983 and 2013, that there has been a lot of good liaison with those holding the protests and the Gardaí. And I don't think the only time I've ever experienced anything bad was with the protests with Sinn Féin and the IRA, but that was their objective anyway. No matter what you did, that was their objective. They did everything to antagonize, and of course, then they had the media on their side. I've had cameras and in my face and Provo sympathizers shouting in my face, calling me all sorts of everything. The whole trick with that is not to get involved in that. Just keep thinking, well, I'm here getting a paycheck for this, so talk away. So my experience, my own experience, hasn't been as severe as say the Danish experience that was outlined there. But I will say about the COVID, everything has changed since COVID, and we need to get back from this COVID mentality. COVID destroyed policing, and I have always maintained that management and the police allowed the police to be used as the piggies in the middle to do the government's dirty work.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
It was a public health issue, not a criminal matter. And sadly, people were angry, they were annoyed, they were frustrated, they were fed up. And of course, who did they take it out on? The guard who has been directed to say you have to leave the pub. Imagine a police officer telling an adult man or woman that they have to leave a pub, they can't drink because of a flu virus. So
yeah, it was an incredible time, Declan. And I remember liaising in with the Specialist Operation Group down here in Victoria itself. And at the time, there were many groups of concern were looking to take actions. But I was totally taken aback that the Office of Liaison had been effectively removed during that period. And there's only one outcome when liaison is removed from the interface of the police and the public, and that's a negative outcome. Yeah. And that negative outcome, as you say, creates an an image, which which is easily played by the mainstream media. And of course, I witnessed that over here. The moment there would be a flashpoint, you would have the media there just to catch the flashpoint and associate flags with that situation, and then try and cast aspersions across everybody and tarnish them with the one brush to try and say that this is a rabble, this is a group of crazy people. And again, we spoke last week about how reasonable cause to suspect has been replaced with the term in many cases as conspiracy theory, which has stopped members from applying that critical foundation of policing, which is that reasonable cause. And again, there's the power of the esoteric. It's a powerful thing, and we need to be wise. We need to know that this is a tool that can be used to drive agenda, political agenda as well in the background. You just have to be cognizant of that.
That's it, because we all have to remember that media don't report the news to create a narrative around which to report the news to influence public opinion. And COVID was a huge example of that. But my own experience now dealing with people at protests and liaising with people, I have to say, has been very good. And I have been to several protests, policemen, several protests, people legitimately protesting over legitimate issues. And I have to say that it has always, in my experience, it has always been very, very good, except when it came to extraditions and Sinn Féin IRA, who have their agenda to push. And unfortunately, you know yourself how all that works out.
I do indeed. Well, just go back to that Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation document that I was reading from earlier on. It says here, many local officials enforce time, place, and manage restrictions in principled ways that are consistent with the Constitution. However, others abuse their discretion by restricting freedom of speech and assembly in ways that are illegal, leading to numerous lawsuits. Now, when I say numerous lawsuits, that means to me numerous negative interfaces with the police again, on the front line. And again, this is when we see these lawsuits cropping up, this is showing where the fellow on the front line is after being left hang out to dry, misdirected, and left in a situation where they're liable for their own actions, but not fully aware. And again, the human situation comes out when you have that interface where aggression is the order of the day. Well, people react negatively within the uniform if they're not trained well, or if they don't have enough years under the hat that to be a bit wise. You get young lads in the job and they have a knee-jerk reaction, and then that can cause a problem. That can escalate things on both sides and vice versa. So which is why I think it's really critical that we have reasonable and effective liaison at any of these events.
The COVID thing has done exactly that here. It has with the young people. I think the police here, the Gardaí here, have lost the teenager 20 and 20-something generation because of some reactions by some Gardaí that I saw over COVID that saddened me. And one of them was the Stag's Head pub there in off Thames Street. All adults in all age groups were all had to sit outside to have a drink, and they're all responsible people. And next thing, the police came around on the instructions of our chief medical officer that all pubs have to be closed because of the spread of this. And we had a windy government and windy Garda management, and he said jump, and they all asked how high, sir. And there was a young police officer there outside this pub. He was about 6'2", young fella, big muscly fella, and he's standing there with the legs apart and the arms folded, looking seriously at people. And I felt like going up to him and saying, "Would you ever just fucking cup yourself on? I mean, for God's sake, this whole thing is absolutely crazy." With decent people, and they're the decent people, the guy and the girl in the middle. They're the people that all police forces can't afford to lose, because once you lose them, you've lost it. So
thanks for that. But there's huge ramifications for this as well. I mean, we got two impacts of this negative presentation that occurs, and that's one is the impact on the police, and the other is what is the impact on the people. And if you just look at what is, let's just look at the police side. I mean, because people forget that the police are actually impacted by this as well, and all the negative commentary that comes out afterwards, because people refer to them and they, and of course that includes everybody that wears the uniform. Everybody who wears the uniform doesn't operate like that, but they get tarnished, and it does affect them. And I'll just refer to another study here, and again I'll put the links on the YouTube account. But we have the University of Nebraska, Omaha. The 15th of the 10th, 2015, they brought out a study on the impact of negative publicity on police self-legitimacy. Yeah. And an extract from the findings, it says, unfortunately, it appears that such negative publicity has a deleterious relationship with the officer's sense of self-legitimacy. That's effectively their confidence in knowing that they're upholding the law, and they have confidence in their job, and they have confidence that the people and management support them. Yeah, but this is bad for law enforcement agencies and the communities that they serve. Therefore, self-legitimacy is more than theoretically important. It speaks directly to the public's well-being. And some of the impacts that he outlined was, number one was withdrawal, lack of motivation, isolation, and of course the effects of depression and everything else, which you've seen throughout the job ourselves. We've seen it many a time. But so there seems to be a double-sided blade here. Mads, I'd like to bring you in on this as well. You've seen a lot of the members just kick back and switch off because of the this image that's been presented over the last couple of years. Has broken a lot of members' spirits.
Yeah, I think it's a spiral that's going around with this. When you constantly put all these officers out in negative energy, negative environments, it's a bad feeling of going to work. It's a bad interactions with people out there.
Yep.
They end up exactly like you said, Ed, and like the article also mentions, you end up in this spiral of being in a bad mood, being bad energy when you're at work, and when you're then dealing with the public, you give them a bad impression. They get a bad impression about police, and then it spirals out of control, and it's just a never-ending story. Like Declan was saying, I think the young generation here in Denmark has also been lost. They have no trust in police. Most of them, they hate them, outright hate them because of their dealings with them. I've talked to young people who's ended up, riding home without lights on their bikes, drunk, whatever. They end up in altercations with the police, end up on the ground in handcuffs over something as simple as a missing light on the bike. They might have had a smart mouth or something on them. And then the police, in my opinion, they overreact when young people or other people, they talk back to them. A police officer, they are human beings. They should be able to handle those, name calling on whatever is going on out there without it letting it impact how they deal with the public. But I think the tendency here is that the officers at the station, they are so pressured in so many ways that when they go out on the road dealing with people, they end up taking those frustrations out on the public.
Yeah. Did you want to come in on that, Declan? Is that Declan want to come in?
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. And in my day, you got them out, you got grief, but that was part and parcel of the job. And you you let it go, and you had your own canteen talk afterwards. That's how you got rid of it, how you dealt with it. So I totally agree. But the COVID has changed, and we've lost, and because of COVID and government policy, police forces, I think, have lost a young generation. And that explains why we're finding it very hard to get recruits.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there for that relationship to be built back up again, of course.
Totally.
And then, of course, we got to look at what's the impact on the people, with all of this negative press as well. And I can totally relate to this again from what we saw here in Victoria, which was outrageous. We saw bearcats driving down the street. These armored tanks type vehicles. With the guys with the combat gear on and all tooled up. And it looked like the lads were going to war, and they were going into police a protest with unarmed protesters. And that was at the time when they started to use these plastic bullets, or the kinetic impact projectiles. And I know a chap here was actually hit with one of them, and it was just sheer fear propagation. But I'll just refer to another document here, and again I'll put the link in. It's a media release from the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva, the 20th of June 2022, which is interesting, written by Clement Navoul, a lawyer, UN Special Reporter on the right to peaceful assembly and association. And he suggests that the militarized policing of protests has a particularly intimidating effect on women protesters, who sometimes face sexual abuse as a weapon to silence them. He's deeply critical of the growing use of unlawful and excessive force whilst policing protests, including shoot to kill in extreme cases, blanket shoot to kill orders, and the misuse of less lethal weapons. He suggests that this must stop and peaceful protests should be facilitated. Right now, this is a situation where we know that there's global recommendations on the disuse of non-lethal weapons such as KIPs, kinetic the projectiles, the plastic bullets, right? But yet they were used on protesters that were not a threat, that were not armed. And serious questions have to be asked about this, because the ramifications on the welfare of the people who experience this is hugely negative. And it made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I have to ask, well, who's setting the baseline for this? We have guidelines there, but how do we call out when fellas are out, stepping outside the guidelines? How can the people call this out? We just seem to be hitting blank walls all the time.
Look at the political ideology that's behind it all at the moment. The left
seems to be.
The left is hate. Left is hatred. It's all about hate, in my opinion. There's no middle ground. There's no balance. It's their way or their way, and the left has been responsible for pushing a lot of this. I'm taking it. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know. Mads, what do you think? Mads is looking to come in there. He's got a comment on that. Mads?
Yeah, it was just in regards to the protests. Generally, most of the protests here in Denmark during COVID has been fairly peaceful. The problem is police, they exactly like they did in Melbourne. They show up fully dressed in riot gear, fully armored to the teeth. You know, they're exactly like that, look like they're ready for war.
Mhm.
We had one protest here in Copenhagen that went really, really bad, where police actually boxed people in the walking street in the center of Copenhagen, and they literally just started beating the crap out of everyone around. Old people, young people, everyone that was near them, they got hit with the batons.
Can I ask, Matt,
Um,
to be note with these units, the units that were doing this, we had a situation here where we had the specialist operations group here in Victoria were policing most of the protests. However, the public order unit were always on standby there in the background, you know, once dispersal orders had been given. And, you know, once they got the dispersal order, the specialist operation group, as I understood it, they lost control of the situation. It was handed over to them. But
hmm.
they almost seemed to be a unit operating off their own bat as such, and certainly didn't represent all of the police around the state here in the different stations, how they engaged with the public. There was many different experiences of people dealing with the police at the time. So it wasn't one size fits all at all. But there seemed to be units operating off their own bat there, which certainly weren't operating within these international guidelines on best outcomes.
Like
Is
in
that what you
Denmark,
saw there? And is that what you saw over in Denmark?
yeah, Copenhagen is generally the same unit. Copenhagen police is fairly big. We don't have the same specialist units as you do in Australia. We have more of like a general policing units.
Right.
Um, but generally, it's the same on-road supervisors that are out there for the protests, and they're the ones who's calling the shots. I'm sorry, there's a bit of noise.
Right.
So the on-road supervisors here, they're the ones who's calling the shots out there, and you can see it. All the young officers out on the road, whenever things get tense, they start looking over their shoulder to look for the on-road supervisor, because they seem, again, like I said earlier, they don't seem to know what they're actually doing. They don't seem to know what's actually going on, and they're unsure about themselves. I think if
Yeah.
police officers lose confidence in themselves, and if they lose the ability to communicate, just use the verbal communication, then we're really in a bad place. One of the first things we got taught at the Western Australia Police Force was that never ever take your hands or your weapons out unless you have tried talking first. Try and come to a reason, try and come to an understanding first, and if you can't do that, then you can escalate it.
Yep.
Danish police seem to be starting at the top. They show up in riot gear. They don't want to answer your questions. They just give you orders, and if you don't follow their orders, you end up on the ground in handcuffs.
This doesn't
Um,
make sense. This is contrary to all of the studies, all of the various studies of all of the best outcomes over the last number of years, 50, 60 years of protests, a little bit longer. This goes against the grain. So one has to
yeah.
ask why? Why, when we know what is best practice, why is this the case? You know, is it agenda, or is it a failing of our police
For,
forces?
for me, it seems to be a political idea. And it's been like that for many years, because the police in Denmark, you can see that police is run by political agendas. They're not run out from a police aspect.
Yeah.
The top boss in the Danish police, the police commissioner for all of Denmark, he, by law, he has
Mhm.
to be have a degree inside law, but he doesn't have to have a police education. So the top police boss is a lawyer who's more of a politician than he's actually a police officer. And I think that is where some of the problems are lying.
I think
When
that's a
you
huge
put
problem. Mm.
when you put non-police officers in to be bosses of police officers with no
Yeah.
clue of what's going on the road,
Yeah.
then you have a serious problem.
I think I'll ask Declan about that. Declan, we'd be familiar with that. Is Declan there?
Because
Mm.
can you hear me?
I have you now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I agree with everything there. Because people who have, as I said to you before, you don't need a good education to be a police officer. You just need a bit of basic common sense. And when you have these highfalutin educated people, they work to their own agendas, and they're self-promotion the whole time. And like was as explained there, you can't have a civilian in charge of the police because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. And the only solution to him is to put him into a policeman's uniform and put him on the front row of a riot and let him learn from experience.
Yeah, no, very true, very true. Tomo hasn't managed to jump on with us, but I know I was in communication with Tomo earlier, and Tomo now does a lot of work with the fire people up in Queensland, the fire brigade guys, and there's a lot of disconnection between the men in suits and the men in boots.
Yeah.
The men in boots have some, big concerns about fire loadings here, for example, where they're not being given permits to get them sorted out in advance of the summer fire season. And it beggars belief that this is the situation that they're in. However, there's bureaucrats blocking what should be taking place for the safety of the public. There seems to be this disconnect between the frontline guys and the pen pushers up top, which is just going to lead to a disaster, which we can talk further about next week. But
what do you think? What do you mean about for these fire officers to create a fire break? So if a natural fire breaks out, it can be contained. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about in fire loading areas. Yeah, so they're planning for and this business where you have people on the interface who know what the problems are on the ground, but are getting blocked by bureaucracy or pen pushing stuff upstairs is a problem, and it's continuing as we have a docile public that aren't really aware or engaged with the frontline services, in a supportive capacity. I mean, this is something that we all need to be concerned about.
That's what happened in California. Because of leftist politics, they weren't allowed to do this because it's all about the environment. Let the environment preserve the environment. They weren't allowed to create these fire breaks to prevent these disasters. Then that works into the climate change delusion. Oh, it's climate change. Oh, it's climate change. It's not. It's if they were managed properly, these things wouldn't happen. And then there's a lot of these cases, as in Rhodes and in Tenerife, those fires were started by arsonists, but you won't hear about that. So it's all political. It's all an agenda. The whole thing is working to an agenda, and mainstream media is playing its part to keep people ignorant. Sorry for the rant.
No, you're okay.
I think that's the problem all across the board, that everything has become political. Yeah. Everything is political agendas. Environment, policing, firefighters, everything has turned into money and politics. And police should not be about money and politics. It should be about human beings.
Correct. Independent 100%. And impartial.
Like every boss for every district in Denmark, all the police bosses, they're on a commission-based salary. That means the more numbers they bring in, the higher their salary. The more arrests, the more tickets, the more everything they do that can be measured, the higher their salary. And if they don't fulfill the criteria, they get fired. We put a new boss in place.
That's what's happening here. That's what's happening here in Ireland now with this new hate speech bill, but there's no definition of what hate speech is. And it's all pushing this agenda, criminalizing thought. That's what it is.
Well, it's a disgrace. I'll just go back to that Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation document. They at the very end of that document, they looked at, well, what could be a possible solution for all of this negative engagement, of course, between the police over the last number of years on protests, and they referenced principles of community police and provide a useful foundation upon which to develop fair and effective protest policing strategies. And I agree with that 100%, that the only way to do this is to go to the village, as I say, and connect with the community, looking at what the real problems are on the ground and highlighting those problems and working with the local police at the ground level. Instead of waiting for things to boil up and then to become big groups, and then there's an interface and a standoff between police, which largely the outcome is dependent on the quality of the management that's directing that event on the day. And it's and clearly we can see if there is, and I say if there is, agenda in the background which is driving this step away from international standards and international recommendations and studies and outcomes, there's reasonable cause to suspect that there's some sort of interference there, and there's it's necessary that we step back into the village and we begin again. Mads and myself and many other ex-police members spend time trying to connect with police and police stations here, but their hands were tied to such an extent that they couldn't really speak to you at all.
Yeah.
You'd have to go through
Yeah.
media first. Everything is vetted, so it's very hard to get a heart-to-heart conversation with the police because they're restricted from what they can say, and of course they're under pressure from their peers, and they're under pressure from middle management and all the rest of it. They have their social medias being monitored. Everything else. They're really being clamped down. But a different way we
they're
can
hard to
do.
reach.
Yeah. Sorry, Mads. Go ahead. I digress.
Exactly like you're saying, it's hard to get a hold of them. It's hard to reach them because everyone they have to look to their bosses. The bosses have to look to their bosses, and they have to look to the people behind them who's actually pulling the strings and deciding what budget they're gonna get and everything else. So
Yes.
everything is being shut down. All avenues of communication with these local police or the police that actually has a fair idea of what's going on is being shut down. And the few people that actually have the courage to have that discussion and go into those communications and voice some concerns and say there is some issues here we need to address, they get shut down internally by management, disciplinary actions, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's become a tyranny in there, I think, and police has become a government lapdog instead of actually policing for the people.
Yes, I saw that very early in my career. And part of what the problem is there are many of our own within our jobs who do anything for the next jump, next promotion. So that's what they're dealing with too.
Yeah. Well, I can give. I think I mentioned last week, or I may have mentioned last week. I've started a campaign is the wrong word, I suppose. A process whereupon we're taken to the villages over here. I'm calling it Advocates of Reason, where we're just advocating reason and listening to the public, listening to what their concerns are, and outlining each one. Going back the following week, looking for solutions from the local communities. Today, I hooked in with the local police, the local community police, and they were very supportive about what we were doing and want to support us. Yeah. And, because again, it's grassroots, it's a perfect connection. And, it shows that there's a human inside the box. We're all concerned about the problems that are facing our community. And I think this is truly the way to do it. So instead of waiting until everything escalates, let's be proactive and begin with asking the questions of the community. Well, what are your concerns? And then working together with the local police at grassroots to try and bring solutions and work together moving forward. That way we have the connection, and that way we can have productive outcomes as against this complete disconnect that's manifested itself over the last number of years.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, Australia and New Zealand shocked me over the COVID. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it.
It was incredible down here in Victoria, in particular.
I was watching it on Sky News Australia. I was watching it all.
Yeah. It was incredible. I mean, the overreach was outstanding. I couldn't believe it. Which is what people step out of retirement and step back in and start. So that was. I hooked in with the guys down with Police for Freedom. They were established by the Police Association, Police per Libertad, in Spain back in 2020, and the vision, you could see that this was a problem that was presented, this lack of police liaisons. So that's where we stepped in, starting to liaise to try and de-escalate, to step away from that chaotic environment. And it wasn't easy, Mats. Like you say, there's a lack of trust. The minute you said you had been in the police or you're associated with the police, it took people a long time to connect with you and trust you. And you had to build up your connection with them over time. So it was
taken many hours on the streets walking around with them until they actually start trusting you a little bit.
Yeah, good people, great guys, but again, people that were in fear. And people, like the people that I've worked with, wonderful people of heart. And the way that the media has portrayed them is disturbing, and many mothers, young mothers, single mothers with young kids just trying to express their concerns. They were about to lose their jobs and to be hit with $5,500 fines, for expressing themselves whilst, even working around the restrictions. So they weren't breaching any restrictions, and still crazy.
I think that's important to keep trying to remind police officers out there that the people they're standing there facing in the protest are actually not hooligans and gang members like the media is trying to portray them. They are everyday citizens. They just have concerns for their welfare and for how the country is going.
Yeah.
Look at the worst. Look at the worst example we had over in Canada with that idiot Justin Trudeau, as I call him, with what he did with the truckers, and that was, and the police just did his dirty work for him. That was disgraceful. I mean, that made me embarrassed to be a former police officer, to be honest about it. You know, just shocking.
Well, I can say is, I can give you an example of the power of positive liaison. I worked in with a group over here called Reclaim the Line, and I wrote a document on police engagement, and I helped them liaise on the day. You know, it was full liaising with the local guys. There was no pressure. Everything was all fully, up front, full engagement, and an absolute success around the country. We had the biggest protest event supported by the police here since the beginning of the whole pandemic, and we had incredible scenes of police dancing, believe it or not, on the streets with some of the people up in I remember up in Queensland there was those famous photographs coming out. But that's what we want to get back to. We want to get back to where we are protecting the police for the people, because that's effectively what I believe we need to do now, and never in history has it been as important as it is now. To work together with our local police. Mads, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, but for that to happen, we also need to change that direction it's going, and in the top in there, because here in Denmark, like police, they can not attend a COVID protest. They cannot attend a lot of these things. They get tied their hands, but to attend an LBG, whatever alphabets they put on parade, they're allowed to do that. So again, it's the whole. I don't know how to deal with that, but.
I think it's just by raising awareness about the inconsistencies in the management side of it. Really, I mean, this is not about individuals. It's educating the people that there's a way of doing things, and the question is, well, why is it not being done to best practice?
Because honestly, I think if a Danish police officer at a COVID protest here in Denmark starts dancing, and there's a video on social media, he'll be suspended. He'll be in disciplinary action.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to be happy and joyful, it seems. And I think that's what we started talking about, that when you put that much pressure on these officers on the street, they end up losing their joy of actually going out to help people and do their job, and they end up being bitter and miserable souls that is just out there and taking their frustrations out on the people.
You mentioned something. You mentioned there about police officers dancing on the street and then over-engaging with the LGBTQIA and WTF crowd. We should, with all of these things, the police officer is not to get involved in any of this type of thing. Your job is to stand back after you've discussed the rules of engagement, shall we say, for the protest or whatever it is. You stand back to monitor that people have the right to engage in their freedoms of speech, expression, and opinion. It's not for you to start dancing around the place and dressing up like a Xanadu production. That's not the job of the police officer. His job is to make sure that people have the right to exercise their expression peacefully and within the rule of law. Now, I'll just finish at one thing to just show how embarrassing that type of thing is. We over here, I thought it was a joke until I found out it was real. We had a group of Gardaí police officers, big burly men, walking around in red high heel shoes to celebrate. To try and understand what it's like to walk in the shoes of a woman. Now, for fuck's sake, pardon my language, I mean, honest to God, Eddie, you know characters we work with. Can you imagine the likes of some of the characters we know walking around in a pair of high heel shoes to test themselves? Oh, I know what it's like to be. I know what it's like to be a woman. Oh, that type of shit has to stop. I mean, that's not policing. That's part of the problem. You stand there.
Exactly.
You're independent, you're impartial. You stand there and you do your job, no matter what the protest is. You allow people to have the protest, and then you all go home.
Yeah, 100%.
I agree.
So, guys, we're just running out of time here. We got 2 minutes left. Mads, I want to bring you in for the finish off. Unfortunately, Tomo didn't get to join us. He's obviously out of coverage. That's okay. I'll just mention that next week we're going to do a show on why the suits don't listen to the boots. Why are the suits not listening to the boots? That's what we're going to talk about next week. But Mads, if you want to run us out there, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I don't know what else there is to say, but I
There's
think it's
work to be
going in a
done.
good.
Yeah. Mm,
There's a lot of work to be done. I
mm.
think it's starting in the right place, and like you said, I think you just gotta keep raising awareness to it. But this time, instead of trying to reach the top brass in there constantly, get the community.
Yeah.
I think that's the only way to change the policing world in there is that the normal, everyday citizen, they start speaking up.
Yeah.
They really have
Uh,
to start going into the police station and saying, we are not happy with the service you're providing us. We are paying taxes for you to do your job. You're here for us. And
yeah.
we need you to attend when someone burgles our homes, when we have
Mhm.
accidents, whatever. We need police to attend. And we don't want you to be a government lapdogs anymore. I don't think you'll change the policy in the police until people actually start going against it and saying enough is enough. The same with the
Yeah.
COVID and the government. People need to stand up and say no.
Yeah. And at the
And then
same time, yeah. At the same time, is it's bearing in mind that if we're just there throwing verbal words at the guy in the front line, it's just disempowering and it's making the situation worse. We have to be aware that there's bigger issues in the background is affecting the frontline service.
yeah, and that
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the other side of the coin, also educate the citizens out there on their rights. What are
Yes.
they actually obliged to when police approach them? What are police allowed to? How to deal
Yeah.
with them? How to respond to police? And unfortunately, we're living in a world where I think the citizens are the one who now has to learn how to de-escalate a situation, whereas it's supposed to be police that
Yeah.
comes to de-escalate. But I think that the normal everyday people, they're the ones who have to learn their rights and learn how to de-escalate a situation with police to avoid all these things.
Well, we can try and help them do that, guys. We're going to have to wrap it up, so I'm going to thank you again. I look forward to talking next week. We'll finish off here with a tune after we sign off. But thanks again, Declan. Thanks, Mads.
Bad boys, what you want, what you want, what you gonna do when Sheriff John Brown come for you? Tell me what you gonna do, what you gonna do? Yeah, bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? When you were 8 and you had bad traits, you go to school and learn the golden rule. So why are you acting like a bloody fool? If you get hot, then you must get cool. Bad boys, what you gonna do? Or what you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? Or what you gonna do when they come for you? You chuck it on that one, you chuck it on this one, you chuck it on your mother and you chuck it on your father, you chuck it on your brother and you chuck it on your sister, you chuck it on that one and you chuck it on me. Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Nobody now give you no break. Police now give you no break. That old soldier man I give you no break. Not even your eyes now give you no breaks. Well, hey, bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Why did you have to act so mean? Don't you know you're a human being? Born of a mother with the love of a father. Reflection comes and reflection goes. I know sometimes you wanna let go. Hey, I know sometimes you wanna let go. Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Don't you What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? You chuck it on that one, you chuck it on this one, you chuck it on your mother and you chuck it on your father, you chuck it on your brother and you chuck it on your sister, you chuck it on that one and you chuck it on